The first motorcycle rolled into Ash Creek Valley at 4:11 in the morning. By 4:17 there were already more than 100. By 5 o'clock the valley sounded like war. 1,200 motorcycles thundered through the darkness beneath freezing rain clouds, their headlights flooding the narrow mountain roads in endless white beams, while terrified homeowners stood at bedroom windows watching leather-clad riders pour into town like an invading army. Chrome glistened beneath storm water. V-twin engines shook the valley floor hard enough to rattle kitchen cabinets. And at the center of that impossible convoy sat a tiny collapsing farmhouse where a blind old man quietly stirred soup on a rusted stove, completely unaware that his simple act of kindness had just awakened something enormous. 3 sheriff cruisers blocked the entrance to Willow Street by sunrise, but the officers inside never stepped out, because there are moments when lawmen realize they are no longer controlling the situation. This was one of them. A television reporter stood shivering beside the barricade while hundreds upon hundreds of Hell's Angels filled both sides of the muddy road in absolute silence, rain dripping from black leather cuts and tattooed hands wrapped around handlebars. No shouting, no threats, just the kind of silence that arrives before something irreversible happens. Then one massive biker with a gray beard stepped forward slowly and pointed toward the rotting farmhouse at the end of the street. "That old man fed our brothers," he said. The reporter swallowed visibly. The biker's eyes never blinked. "And now nobody touches this valley again." But to understand why 1,200 Hell's Angels descended on a forgotten California valley prepared for war, we need to go back to the lonely November evening when Walter Greene heard someone knocking through the rain. The storm arrived just before sunset. Cold Pacific rain slammed into Ash Creek Valley beneath charcoal skies, while bitter mountain wind swept dead leaves across cracked roads and sagging wooden fences. Walter Greene sat alone beside the tiny wood stove inside his collapsing farmhouse, listening carefully to the weather the way blind people learn to listen to everything. Rain sounded different on old roofs. You could hear weakness in wood. You could hear leaking nails. You could hear decay. Walter heard all of it. The farmhouse had been dying for years. So had the valley around it. Once, Willow Street held 12 families. Children rode bicycles down gravel driveways while neighbors shared coffee on porches beneath enormous pine trees. Now only 4 elderly residents remained. Everyone else had sold out or been forced out. The developers came first, then the intimidation, then the lawsuits, then the utility shutoffs. Piece by piece, Ash Creek Valley became prey for men with expensive shoes and cold hearts. Men like Elias Turner. Walter slowly adjusted the soup pot above the stove while the smell of chicken, broth and old iron filled the tiny kitchen. His hands moved carefully across familiar surfaces scarred by decades of use. Blindness teaches memory. Every chair, every crack in the floorboards, every cabinet handle. He memorized the world because he could no longer see it. A faded photograph sat beside the stove. Walter touched the frame gently with weathered fingers. His wife Margaret smiled back forever from inside the glass. 48 years married, gone 6 winters now. The silence after losing her never truly left the house. It just settled deeper into the walls. Outside, thunder rolled through the valley. Walter heard another sound beneath it. Engines, far away, struggling. Then silence again. The old man frowned slightly. Motorcycles. He recognized the sound instantly. Years ago, before darkness swallowed his vision completely, bikers sometimes stopped through Ash Creek Valley heading north toward mountain highways. Most towns feared them. Walter never understood why. People reveal themselves most honestly when exhausted and cold, and tired travelers were usually just tired men. Rain hammered harder against the windows now. Then came the knock. 3 heavy strikes against the front door. Walter stiffened immediately. Nobody visited Willow Street anymore, especially not during storms. Another knock echoed through the farmhouse, closer this time. Walter carefully stood from the table, one hand trailing across the wall as he moved toward the door through darkness that never ended anymore. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots. Wind whistled through gaps in the old windows. He unlocked the door slowly. Cold rain exploded into the house instantly, and behind it stood 2 enormous men dripping water across the porch beneath leather motorcycle vests and road-worn denim. One of them was bleeding, not badly, but enough that Walter smelled fresh iron beneath the rainwater. The larger biker spoke first. "Sorry to bother you, sir," he said. "Bike broke down half a mile back. We were hoping maybe to use a phone." Walter listened carefully to the voice. Tired, respectful, not dangerous. The old man smiled faintly. Ain't had a working phone since spring, he admitted. Storm killed the lines again. Thunder cracked overhead hard enough to shake the porch roof. The injured biker shifted painfully beside the railing. Walter tilted his head slightly. You boys cold? The bikers exchanged a quick glance. The larger man answered carefully. We've been worse. Walter opened the door wider immediately. Well then, standing in the rain seems foolish. Soup's hot. The two bikers froze for half a second, because kindness surprises hardened men more than violence ever does, especially unexpected kindness. Inside, the farmhouse smelled like old wood smoke, broth, and worn blankets dried beside the stove. The bikers ducked carefully through the tiny kitchen while rainwater dripped from their leather cuts onto cracked linoleum floors. Walter moved calmly toward a cabinet. Only got enough bowls for company if you don't mind mismatched dishes. The larger biker stared quietly at the old man's cloudy eyes. You blind? Walter chuckled softly. Most days, that answer hung in the kitchen strangely. Simple, honest, no bitterness inside it. The injured biker sat carefully near the stove while Walter filled bowls with soup using slow, practiced movements. The old man never once asked who they were, never asked about the leather patches, never asked about the blood. He simply fed them. Outside, rain battered Ash Creek Valley harder while darkness swallowed the roads entirely. Inside the tiny farmhouse, 3 men shared soup beside a dying stove, and somewhere far away beyond the storm, destiny quietly began turning its engine over. The larger biker's name was Frank Mercer. The injured one was Tommy Vale. Both belonged to the Fresno chapter of the Hells Angels, riding north after attending a memorial service for another club member killed weeks earlier on Highway 99. Walter listened quietly while they spoke. Not much, just enough. The old man had a gift for silence. People trusted silence, especially lonely people. Tommy winced while adjusting his bandaged shoulder. Truck clipped us near the valley road, he muttered. Could have been worse. Walter nodded thoughtfully. Most bad things can. Frank looked around the farmhouse slowly. The ceiling leaked into buckets near the hallway. Wallpaper peeled from damp walls. Cold wind slipped beneath the windows. And despite all of it, Walter apologized before refilling their soup bowls. Wish I had better bread, the old man said quietly. Store trucks stopped coming months ago. Frank frowned immediately. What do you mean stopped coming? Walter hesitated briefly, then sighed. That developer fellow bought most the valley. Elias Turner. Even hearing the name changed the air inside the room. Walter explained slowly. The threats, the fake code violations, the pressure campaigns against elderly homeowners, water shutoffs, property tax manipulation, broken promises. The valley was being strangled deliberately, one house at a time, and the sheriff helps him, Walter added softly. Folks my age don't fight too hard anymore. Frank's expression darkened beneath the stove light. Tommy stopped eating entirely. Walter missed the silence because blind men cannot see anger spreading across another man's face, but they can feel it. The farmhouse suddenly felt heavier somehow. Frank finally spoke carefully. You live here alone? Walter smiled faintly toward Margaret's photograph beside the stove. My wife still fusses at me from heaven every morning. Then quieter. But yes, the rain continued pounding the valley all night long, and before dawn arrived, Frank Mercer quietly stepped outside beneath the storm and made one phone call that changed Ash Creek Valley forever. Frank Mercer stood beneath the farmhouse porch at 2:13 in the morning while freezing rain soaked through his denim collar and rolled off the brim of his weathered black cap. The valley around him looked dead. No porch lights, no traffic, just skeletal pine trees bending beneath storm wind and the distant groan of thunder rolling through the mountains. He pulled out an old flip phone and dialed a number from memory. The line answered on the second ring. This better matter, a rough voice muttered. Frank stared back toward Walter's tiny farmhouse glowing softly through rain and darkness. It matters. Silence. Then Frank spoke again. There's an old blind man up here feeding strangers from an empty kitchen while some developer tears apart his valley. The voice on the line sharpened instantly. What developer? Elias Turner. Another silence followed, heavier this time, because certain names already carried reputations long before stories fully arrived. Frank continued slowly. Houses collapsing, utilities barely work, Guy hasn't got enough food for winter, but he still opened his door to us without asking questions. Thunder cracked overhead. Rain hammered harder against the porch roof. Inside the farmhouse, Walter laughed softly at something Tommy said near the stove. Frank listened for a moment before speaking one final sentence into the phone. Nobody touches this valley again. Then he hung up. That was all it took. By sunrise, the story had begun spreading across California, like wildfire moving through dry brush. A blind widower fed two stranded brothers during a storm while developers tried stealing his home. Men heard that story in Bakersfield garages, in Fresno clubhouses, in Mojave repair shops thick with cigarette smoke and gasoline fumes. They heard it beside highways, beside pool tables, beside memorial walls filled with faded photographs of dead brothers, and something old inside them woke up. Walter Greene slept peacefully through all of it. The old man hadn't shared a meal with company in nearly 7 months. That mattered more to him than motorcycles or trouble or the strange heaviness lingering in Frank's voice before dawn. He simply felt less alone that night, and loneliness can make even tiny moments feel enormous. Morning arrived cold and gray across Ash Creek Valley. Walter woke slowly beneath heavy quilts while rainwater tapped gently against the windows. For a few seconds he forgot people were inside the house. Then he smelled coffee, fresh coffee, real coffee. Not the cheap instant powder he rationed carefully every month. Tommy chuckled softly from the kitchen. Morning, Walter, the old man smiled immediately. You boys still alive? Barely, Frank laughed, but your stove saved our asses. Walter slowly dressed while the farmhouse filled with the smell of coffee, wet leather drying near the heater, and eggs frying in an old cast iron pan. For the first time in years, the house sounded alive again, floorboards creaking beneath boots, coffee cups touching countertops. Human voices moving room to room. Margaret would have loved it. Walter could almost hear her humming in the kitchen again. Outside, the storm finally weakened. Fog rolled slowly through the valley while pale morning sunlight pushed weakly through heavy clouds. Then the engines started, far away at first. Walter paused immediately beside the kitchen table. Frank noticed. You hear that? Walter asked quietly. Frank nodded once. Motorcycles, lots of them. The sound echoed through mountain roads like distant thunder growing steadily louder with every passing minute. Walter frowned slightly. Big group riding through. Frank glanced toward Tommy. Neither answered immediately, because the truth sounded insane even to them. By 7:30 a.m., Ash Creek Valley's narrow roads had become completely overwhelmed. Motorcycles poured through the mountains in endless lines beneath low gray skies. Black Harleys, Road Kings, Street Glides, chrome stretching mile after mile beneath rainwater and cold California dawn light. Local residents stood frozen on porches watching it happen. Some crossed themselves, others locked doors. Nobody had ever seen numbers like this before, not here, not anywhere close. The first wave alone contained over 200 riders, then came more and more and more. By 8 o'clock, the valley sounded like a military invasion. 1,200 Hells Angels and support riders from multiple states descended through the mountains in perfect roaring formation. Nevada, Arizona, Southern California, Oregon. Even riders from Texas and New Mexico appeared beneath club colors darkened by rain and road dust. Gas stations overflowed instantly. Parking lots disappeared beneath chrome. Entire streets became rivers of motorcycles, and every single rider received the same instruction before arriving. Protect the old man. Walter still didn't fully understand what was happening when the first group stopped outside his farmhouse. He heard engines shutting off, boots on gravel, voices, dozens of voices. Then came a knock at the door. Walter opened it carefully. Cold mountain air rushed inside carrying the overwhelming smell of wet leather, motor oil, cigarette smoke, and rain-soaked denim. Someone spoke respectfully. Morning, sir. Walter tilted his head slightly. That you again, Frank? A few nearby bikers smiled instantly at the question. Frank stepped closer. No, sir. Name's Leon. Walter blinked behind cloudy eyes. Oh, Leon looked around the collapsing porch slowly. The sagging roof, the broken railings, the cracked windows stuffed with old towels to stop the cold air. His jaw tightened visibly. We heard you took care of our brothers. Walter shifted awkwardly. Just fed them soup. The men standing behind Leon exchanged dark looks instantly. Because truly decent people often describe extraordinary kindness like it was nothing at all. That always hits harder. Walter listened carefully to the endless motorcycles rumbling throughout. "The valley, you boys all together?" he asked carefully. Leon smiled faintly. "Yes, sir." The old man nodded once. "That's a lot of engines." Frank stepped beside him quietly. "You have any family nearby, Walter?" The question lingered painfully in the cold air. Walter looked toward Margaret's old rocking chair near the window. No, just one word. Small, quiet, but loneliness sat inside it like a lifetime. That answer traveled through the gathered bikers faster than any shouted speech ever could. And something changed, not anger anymore. Something deeper, protectiveness. By noon, Willow Street had become unrecognizable. Hundreds of motorcycles lined both sides of the road beneath pine trees dripping rainwater. Portable grills smoked. Beside garages, support vans unloaded supplies, bikers repaired fences. Others cleared fallen tree branches from elderly neighbors' yards without being asked. Nobody drank, nobody caused trouble. The atmosphere felt disciplined, purposeful, like an army occupying territory after deciding innocent people lived there. Walter sat quietly on his porch wrapped in an old army blanket while strangers repaired. The front steps beneath him, hammering, echoed through the valley. Chainsaws roared in the distance. Somebody fixed the mailbox. Another group repaired the water pump behind the house. Walter kept trying to protest politely. "You boys don't gotta," but nobody listened, because some debts are emotional, and emotional debts get paid in full. Meanwhile, 50 miles away in Sacramento, Elias Turner exploded in rage inside a glass-walled conference room overlooking downtown construction sites. "What do you mean 1,200 bikers?" he shouted. His assistant looked pale. "The valley is completely locked down." Turner slammed paperwork across the table hard enough to scatter documents onto the floor. Elias Turner built his empire by preying on weak communities, retirement towns, low-income valleys, places filled with elderly homeowners who lacked money or energy to fight back legally. He called it redevelopment. Everyone else called it theft. Turner smiled during evictions, actually smiled, because cruelty becomes addictive once. Powerful men stop facing consequences. But this situation felt different immediately. News helicopters already circled Ash Creek Valley. Videos flooded social media. Thousands of viewers watched endless biker convoys filling the mountain roads around Walters Street, and the story spreading online made Turner look monstrous. Blind widower shelters stranded bikers during storm. Developers tried forcing him out. The public backlash exploded instantly. Turner's investors started calling within hours. Then came reporters digging through company records. Former employees began speaking anonymously. Former residents came forward describing intimidation tactics and fraudulent land seizures. Turner suddenly found himself surrounded by cameras instead of lawyers. And fear began creeping into his chest for the very first time. Back in Ash Creek Valley, Walter still couldn't comprehend the scale of what had happened. Children laughed outside for the first time in years while bikers grilled hamburgers near the community center parking lot. Elderly residents emerged slowly from isolated homes, staring in disbelief at dozens of tattooed strangers fixing roofs and carrying groceries through the rain. One old woman cried openly when bikers restored her electricity by replacing damaged lines behind her trailer. Nobody asked for payment, nobody asked for praise. They simply worked, because loyalty creates momentum. And once enough loyal men move in the same direction together, entire worlds begin changing around them. That night, Walter sat beside the stove again, listening to distant engines rumble softly throughout the valley like giant sleeping animals. Frank handed him a fresh bowl of soup quietly. Different soup this time, beef stew from a biker-run food trailer parked outside. Walter smiled faintly. "You boys planning on staying a while?" Frank stared out the window toward endless motorcycles lining Willow Street beneath glowing campfires and cold mountain fog. "Yes, sir." Then quieter, "as long as it takes." The second sunrise over Ash Creek Valley looked completely different from the first. The fear was gone, not entirely, but enough that people started opening curtains again, enough that elderly residents stepped onto porches carrying coffee mugs instead of eviction notices, enough that Willow Street no longer felt abandoned. It felt defended. Cold morning fog drifted between rows of motorcycles while campfire smoke curled lazily into the pine trees surrounding the valley. Leather cuts hung drying beside pickup trucks. coffee brewed from portable burners, and somewhere beneath all the chrome, tattoos, and road scars, 1,200 men quietly prepared for war if necessary. Not because they wanted violence. Because predators only understand strength when it stands directly in front of them. Walter woke to the smell of fresh pancakes. For a brief, confused moment, he thought Margaret was alive again. The memory hit hard enough to stop him cold beside the bedroom doorway. Then Tommy laughed from the kitchen. Frank burned another batch. Reality returned slowly. Walter smiled despite himself. The old farmhouse sounded fuller now, warm, human. The silence haunting the place for years had finally retreated beneath the noise of voices, boots, laughter, and clattering dishes. Walter carefully moved toward the kitchen using the wall for guidance. Someone had repaired the loose floorboard overnight. Another repaired the draft. Near the hallway window, tiny things, tiny acts. But lonely people noticed tiny kindnesses more than anyone else alive. Outside, reporters crowded the valley entrance while state troopers attempted unsuccessfully to control traffic flowing toward Ash Creek from every direction. The story had become national news overnight. Blind widower protected by 1,200 Hell's Angels. Television crews loved the contrast. Fragile elderly man versus ruthless corporate developer. Massive biker mobilization versus wealthy land investors. America always chooses sides fastest when injustice feels obvious, and Elias Turner suddenly found himself cast as the villain in front of millions, which was unfortunate for him, because he absolutely was one. Turner arrived in the valley late that afternoon escorted by private security's UVs and 2 sheriff cruisers. Bad decision. The moment his convoy entered Willow Street, the atmosphere changed instantly. Conversations stopped. Campfires crackled softly beneath gathering silence. Hundreds of bikers turned toward the approaching vehicles. At the exact same time. That kind of synchronized attention unsettles human beings on a primal level. Turner felt it immediately. His confidence cracked the second he stepped from the SUV. The valley smelled like pine smoke, gasoline, rain-soaked leather, and tension. Rows of motorcycles stretched endlessly beneath gray skies. Everywhere he looked, hard eyes stared back silently. Nobody shouted threats. Nobody moved aggressively, which somehow felt far more dangerous. Turner adjusted his expensive coat nervously before spotting Walter sitting quietly on the farmhouse porch beneath a blanket. The old man smiled faintly toward the sound of approaching footsteps. Afternoon. Turner stared at him with open disbelief. This was the man. Causing national headlines. Blind, frail, 74 years old. Living inside a collapsing shack, Turner almost laughed. Then he noticed Frank Mercer standing behind Walter with folded arms. And behind Frank stood perhaps 300 bikers watching silently from the muddy road. The laughter died instantly. Turner cleared his throat. "Mr. Greene," he began carefully, "I think there's been a misunderstanding regarding the redevelopment project." Walter tilted his head slightly. "You the fella buying up the valley?" Turner forced a polished smile. "Yes, sir. We're hoping to improve the community by throwing old folks out." Frank interrupted coldly. Turner ignored him. Walter sighed quietly from the porch swing. "Son," the old man said softly, "people don't usually improve places by making everyone afraid." The sentence hit harder than yelling ever could. Simple, honest, true. Turner felt hundreds of eyes on him now. Reporters filmed everything from the road. His polished corporate mask started slipping beneath the pressure. "You don't understand business realities," Turner snapped. "This land is valuable." Frank stepped forward slowly. The movement alone caused several security guards. "Too tense immediately, and Walter isn't." Silence swallowed the valley. Cold wind rustled pine branches overhead while motorcycle engines idled softly in the distance. Turner suddenly realized something horrifying. He couldn't intimidate these people, not legally, not financially, not psychologically, because fear only works when the other side believes they're alone. Walter wasn't alone anymore, not even remotely close. Turner tried regaining control. "Look," he said sharply, "this project is moving forward whether anyone likes it or not." That sentence echoed through the valley, and the reaction was immediate. Hundreds of bikers slowly stood up at once from camp chairs, tailgates, porches, and motorcycles. Leather creaked, boots crushed gravel. Nobody spoke, but the message became terrifyingly clear anyway. No, it wasn't. Turner's security detail shifted nervously. One deputy quietly stepped backward toward his cruiser. Another avoided eye contact entirely. Walter heard the silence changing around him. He frowned slightly. What's happening? Frank kept his eyes locked on Turner while answering softly. Nothing you need to worry about. Turner left the valley less than 4 minutes later. His convoy drove out beneath thousands of silent eyes while news helicopters circled overhead, capturing every humiliating second. And somewhere deep inside Elias Turner's chest, panic finally bloomed fully into terror. Because for the first time in his career, prey had transformed into something untouchable. That evening, more information surfaced publicly. Former Turner employees leaked internal emails describing illegal pressure tactics against elderly homeowners. One accountant released financial records showing falsified tax claims and manipulated appraisals targeting Ash Creek Valley residents. A retired judge even came forward describing bribery allegations buried years earlier. The empire started cracking. Fast, investors fled first. Then contractors abandoned the project. Then state investigators opened formal inquiries. Everything Turner spent years building suddenly began collapsing in public view. Meanwhile, bikers rebuilt Willow Street one house at a time. Generators arrived, roofers arrived, electricians, plumbers, veterans groups, church volunteers, truckloads of lumber and food. The valley transformed into a living construction site powered entirely by loyalty and outrage. Walter sat on the porch listening to hammers and engines from sunrise until dark every day afterward. Sometimes he cried quietly when nobody noticed, because kindness hurts lonely people in unexpected ways once they stop expecting it entirely. 3 days later, the final blow landed. Federal investigators raided Elias Turner's corporate offices at dawn. Fraud, tax crimes, land seizure violations, wire fraud, extortion allegations. Television cameras captured Turner being escorted from his headquarters in handcuffs while protesters outside cheered openly. The same man who terrorized elderly residents for years suddenly looked very small beneath flashing lights and federal jackets. And when reporters asked what caused the investigation, one answer appeared repeatedly across news stations nationwide: Ash Creek Valley. The blind old man. The bikers. Walter heard the news from a tiny radio beside the stove. He sat silently afterward for nearly a full minute. Then he whispered toward Margaret's photograph. Guess. Somebody finally listened. Winter arrived early that year. Snow dusted the mountain roads surrounding Ash Creek Valley while cold wind carried the smell of pine, wood smoke, and diesel through the rebuilt neighborhood. But Willow Street no longer looked forgotten. Fresh paint covered old houses. New roofs gleamed beneath pale sunlight. Porches stood repaired. Streetlights worked again for the first time in years. And every mailbox along the valley road had been replaced by tattooed bikers working through freezing nights beneath portable floodlights. The transformation felt unreal, like grief itself had slowly been rebuilt into something warm again. Walter noticed it differently than everyone else, not through sight, through sound. Children visited again. Neighbors talked outside after dark without fear. Front doors opened and closed throughout the day instead of remaining permanently locked. The valley sounded alive again. That mattered more than appearances ever could. One afternoon, Walter sat wrapped in heavy blankets beside the porch while snowflakes drifted softly through the pine trees. Frank handed him a cup of coffee. Real coffee again. Walter smiled faintly. You boys ever planning on going home? Frank leaned against the railing beside him. Walter, he said carefully, this is home now too. The old man went quiet, because certain sentences reach places inside human beings untouched for years. Walter spent most of his life working sawmills, raising children who moved away, and loving one woman faithfully until death stole her from him. He never expected to become important to anyone again. Old age teaches people invisibility. Society slowly stops seeing you, until one day you realize nobody calls anymore unless they need paperwork signed. But 1,200 men cross state lines for him. That changes something inside a soul permanently. The official announcement came 1 week later. State authorities permanently halted Elias Turner's development permits. Every land acquisition tied to fraud investigations became frozen under federal review, and a nonprofit coalition backed by veteran groups, biker organizations, and community donors purchased the entire Willow Street district outright. Protected senior housing. Permanent residency guarantees. No evictions. No predatory development. No corporate buyouts. The news spread through Ash Creek Valley like wildfire. Elderly residents cried openly during the community meeting held inside the old church hall. Some hadn't slept peacefully in years, fearing eviction notices or utility shutoffs. Now the fear was gone, not temporarily, gone. Walter sat quietly in the front row listening while applause echoed around him. Then someone placed a folded document into his hands. The deed, his farmhouse, fully restored ownership protections filed permanently under state law. Walter's fingers trembled across the paper edges. For a few seconds, he couldn't speak at all. Frank knelt beside his chair quietly. "You're safe now." Walter lowered his head. The old man cried silently in front of everyone, not loud sobbing. Just exhausted tears finally escaping after years spent carrying fear alone. Nobody looked away, because strong men recognize sacred moments when they see them. Outside the church hall, rows upon rows of motorcycles stretched beneath gray winter skies while snow drifted softly across chrome and leather. The engines remained silent. For once, the valley itself felt peaceful, complete. That night, Walter walked slowly through his restored farmhouse using a polished wooden cane gifted by one of the bikers from Arizona. The floors no longer creaked dangerously beneath him. The roof no longer leaked. Warm air flowed steadily through repaired vents, and beside the stove stood a brand-new rocking chair almost identical to Margaret's old one. Walter touched the wood carefully, then smiled through tears. "Those boys spoil me," he whispered toward the empty kitchen. But the greatest surprise came 2 mornings later. Walter woke to unfamiliar sounds outside: construction vehicles, laughter, heavy machinery. Frank guided him carefully toward the porch. "What's all this?" Walter asked. Frank smiled. "Community center." Walter frowned slightly. "For who?" "For everybody." Over the following months, the bikers returned again and again to Ash Creek Valley. Not for violence, not for intimidation, for barbecues, food drives, veteran support programs, medical clinics for elderly residents. They rebuilt the valley into something stronger than it ever was before Turner arrived. And slowly, public perception changed too. Because television cameras only understand headlines, but communities remember actions. The people of Ash Creek Valley remembered who arrived when they were abandoned, who fixed roofs during snowstorms, who carried groceries for elderly widows, who defended blind old men when powerful businessmen tried crushing them. They remembered. All of it, especially Walter. By springtime, Willow Street had become famous across California. People drove hours just to see the valley defended by bikers and rebuilt through loyalty. Tourists took photographs beside the restored community sign. Veterans groups held annual rides through the mountains, and every single convoy stopped first at Walter Greene's farmhouse. The old man always greeted them the same way: coffee, soup, and a smile, because kindness remained the most natural thing about him despite everything that happened afterward. One evening near sunset, Walter sat beside Frank watching the valley settle beneath golden mountain light. Motorcycles lined the roads peacefully while children rode bicycles again through neighborhoods once swallowed by fear. Walter listened quietly to distant laughter drifting through the trees. "Margaret would have loved this," he said softly. Frank nodded once. "She'd be proud of you." Walter smiled faintly toward the sunset he could no longer see. "No," he whispered, "proud of all of you." The final ride through Ash Creek Valley happened exactly 1 year after the storm. 1,200 motorcycles returned beneath blazing California sunlight while residents lined the streets cheering from restored porches and freshly painted homes. Chrome flashed like rivers of silver beneath the mountains. Children waved homemade signs. American flags snapped sharply in cold valley wind. And at the center of it all sat Walter Greene on his rebuilt porch wearing a thick denim jacket with a tiny support patch sewn carefully above the pocket. The old man looked healthier, stronger somehow, not physically, spiritually. Loneliness had nearly buried him alive before the storm. Now the valley itself breathed around him again. The convoy stretched for miles. Rows upon rows of motorcycles thundered through the mountains while spectators gathered beside roads filming the impossible scene. But nobody there remembered fear anymore, only gratitude, because one act of kindness changed everything. Elias Turner never recovered publicly from the investigation. His company dissolved beneath lawsuits and criminal charges. Investors abandoned him completely. Former associates testified willingly once the empire started collapsing. The same man who once treated elderly residents like disposable obstacles now sat alone facing federal sentencing inside a courtroom nobody pitied him in. Power disappears quickly when cruelty becomes visible. Walter never celebrated Turner's destruction openly. That wasn't his nature. When reporters asked how he felt about the developer losing everything, the old man answered quietly from his porch swing. "I just wanted folks left alone." Simple, honest. That answer spread online almost as fast as the biker convoy videos themselves, because the world grows hungry for decency when cruelty dominates too long. By sunset, the entire valley glowed amber beneath mountain light while engines rumbled softly across Willow Street one final time. Walter stood carefully beside the road holding his cane while hundreds of bikers passed slowly in formation. Many saluted him. Others simply nodded respectfully beneath helmets and sunglasses. Frank Mercer stopped his motorcycle directly beside the porch. "You need anything, you call." Walter laughed softly. "Boy, I'm blind." Frank grinned beneath his gray beard. "We'll still answer." The convoy slowly rolled away afterward beneath enormous California skies painted orange and blood red by the setting sun. Motorcycles disappeared into the mountains mile after mile until only distant engine echoes remained drifting through the valley. Walter stood silently listening long after the final riders vanished. Then he smiled toward the fading sound, because some people arrive in your life like storms, loud, violent, impossible to ignore. But sometimes storms leave behind stronger foundations than existed before they came. That winter, snow fell gently across Ash Creek Valley again, but no elderly resident feared losing their home anymore. No developers circled like vultures. No utility threats appeared in mailboxes. Willow Street remained protected permanently under community ownership, defended not just legally but emotionally, and emotional protection lasts longer than paper contracts ever do. Every Friday evening afterward, Walter hosted soup nights at the new community center. Veterans, travelers, locals. Sometimes bikers rode in from neighboring states just to sit beside the old man who changed an entire valley with one meal shared during a storm. Walter always greeted them the same way. "Soup's hot," nothing more complicated than that, because truly good people rarely realize how extraordinary they are. If this story moved you, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more emotional stories about loyalty, sacrifice, and impossible justice. And down in the comments, tell us the moment that hit you hardest, because sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest storms the world has ever seen.